Rich man and Lazarus parable. I think I made a video not too long ago on it, but it's a very popular parable, and it's used a lot just to read it naturally as it is, even though we're told we have scripture. Why does Christ speak in parables? So that those who don't understand, for those who aren't chosen, so that they don't understand, But to you it is given, his disciples, to understand the parables. And if you understand one fully, you can start to understand, all of them, because he said, if you don't understand this one, how will you understand all the parables? In scripture, a dog represents a Gentile, something lowly, a creature less than human, and the Jews all considered Gentiles anyone who wasn't a blood Hebrew. Anyone who wasn't a blood Hebrew is considered a dog back then. They had enmity between Jew and Gentile. And we know when Paul came along, the Gentiles were being grafted in to the olive tree, to Israel, for the first time in history, for the first time ever. That's why traditional hell is such a damnable doctrine, because Gentiles weren't even offered this grafting in until Paul, from Abraham to Moses, or from Abraham to Christ, that whole period. It was literally Abraham's descendants, and that was the kingdom, that was God's people. They had to be literally related to him so that they would not be illegitimate children. So the dog represents Gentiles, Gentiles, and the rich man represents the Jews, and maybe specifically the priest, the leaders of the Jews. And there's other things Christ said, that judgment was coming on Jerusalem, and they wanted to kill him for that, because he said, not one stone of the temple is going to stand. And they thought that was blasphemy. These were God's people. You have to understand time that, kind of understand their perspective. This is going from Abraham to then. We're God's people. We're a holy nation. We need to be first and not, we need to be head and not tail in the nation, in the world. And they thought Christ was going to be some kind of king like David on the earth, literally, starting then, to take him out of the Roman, control and put them first again. So the rich man represents the Jews, God's people then, the Hebrews, the blood Hebrews, And Lazarus means God will help us, or God helps us, So the name has an important meaning. And the table of which they ate is representing the richness, the fullness of the oracles of God and the Jews. And, they were God's people, a special people. And the Gentiles weren't. The Gentiles didn't even have salvation offered. If they came in, they would be considered. Now, they were told to treat strangers nice, but the only thing that a Gentile could become if they came in, is a stranger. That's what we read. The only thing that they could be, they're a stranger in the land. They're not sons. They're not children. See? The Gentiles didn't have any of this. So the crumbs fell off the table and the dogs licked it, from Abraham to the end of the Old Covenant. They had tiny breadcrumbs of this thing. It's important to understand that the Gentiles were never grafted in until Paul, to the olive tree. Salvation for Gentiles. And you could read, I think in Acts, other places, that they were jealous, they were jealous of Gentiles being saved, and we read that, I think Peter says, they're being saved just like us. And I think it was Peter that received a vision of 4-footed beasts, animals, okay? and it says kill and eat. And later he says this means there's no more enmity between Jew and Gentile, and that this was finally going away. Be good to them, get along. All are, this new covenant was starting to take place, and there's no longer Jew or Gentile. All are one under Christ. There's no difference. There's no race. There's no color. There's no blood. All of this was going away, and the Jews had a hard time accepting this, and they had a hard time accepting that God was going to judge Jerusalem and have a heavy judgment. So Lazarus represents the Gentiles, with God help us. He was the poor man, I think, in there, and the rich, the rich, they were carnally blessed because they were no spiritual people until Christ, but they were rich in that they had the oracles of God, just like Paul says. They had the covenants, they had, all these blessings and stuff when they were obedient and everything. They were God's people. Gentiles were never called God's people back then, ever. Never. And so God helps us is coming to the Gentiles for the first time. And the crumbs would no longer be receiving crumbs, which cannot fill you. No matter how many crumbs you eat, you're never going to be filled. So the Spirit was coming to the Gentiles. Salvation was coming to the Gentiles, the grafting in. And not only that, the table is going to be flipped around. Not only is it coming to Gentiles, he threw down Jerusalem and the blood Hebrews, and he did call a few, like Paul says. He didn't do away with them. It became New Jerusalem. Paul was a Hebrew. I'm the stock of Hebrew, whatever line he was from. I forget which tribe he was from. Tribe of Benjamin, I think. Benjamin. He called me, Paul says, but he's going to call a few. But this is also an important understanding that Christ said Jerusalem, and he's specifically talking about Old Jerusalem here under the Old Covenant still. Jerusalem was going to be trampled by Gentiles, our old understanding of Gentiles, people who aren't blood Jews, trampled by Gentiles until the time of the end, until the Gentiles' time is fulfilled, which is when Christ comes. That's the end of the grafting in of Gentiles. Now, if we believe this scripture, that means they've been trampled all this time. And I believe it's spiritually too. The spiritual Jews, those who believe, are being trampled by spiritual Gentiles, unbelievers, until the time of the end. They don't like us. But that parable is specifically saying it's being flipped over. You had your time of like 2,000 years or whatever it was from Abraham to, and Gentiles didn't receive any of this. Now I'm going to flip it over on them. And Christ says, I'm going to hand it over to the nations, to the Gentiles, to produce the fruit thereof, because you didn't believe me. Most of you didn't believe me, so I'm handing it over to the Gentiles. So now it's been the time of the Gentiles for 2,000 years. God has been calling mostly Gentiles and very few blood Hebrews since then. And that's what the parable is about. So no matter how much the Jews warn and say, they're in this torment now, like the Gentiles were. They didn't have this life. Even if someone were to come alive from the dead, they wouldn't believe. They didn't believe in Moses. And Christ said if they believed in Moses, they would have believed in me. But they didn't believe in Moses and any of his writings. They changed it and twisted it. So they didn't believe in Moses. They won't believe in me. And even if someone were to come from the dead, they would not believe. God hardened them so hard that even if somebody were to come back from the dead, they wouldn't believe. And so now this judgment came on them, and that was this heavy judgment. And all this time, like I believe the scriptures, they're trampled by Gentiles until the time of the end. They're in this torment, in this flame, and there's no crossing. There's nothing they can do. They're blinded for a time, like Paul says, they're blinded. They're partially blinded for a time until the Gentiles be fulfilled. And this is how he flips it over and, suppose makes it fair, because first the blood Hebrews and now it's Gentiles, And that includes a few blood Hebrews, whoever they are. But I don't believe those people in Jerusalem today, what we call Jerusalem over there, are, from Abraham, true blood Hebrews, because he said they would be trampled until the very end, till the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And I explained in my other videos, I think that's being set up for the great deception of God's people coming back to the land, which is what they've taught for so long. But there is no such thing. All are one under Christ. There is no blood Hebrew that counts for anything today. Old covenant passed away, the natural, the shadow, and now the kingdom's been growing. He's been building his church, but it has nothing to do with Abraham's seed. It has everything to do now with this, Abraham's promise, seed of promise, meaning that it's spiritual. If you believe you're connected to Abraham, you are Israel. You are a spiritual Jew, Paul says. Not one outwardly, but one inwardly, You are Abraham's seed, spiritual Jew. And what else is in the parable? I think that covers most of it. There's no crossing over. Okay, there's nothing they can do. They've been blinded for a time, for an age, for a long time. But now the Gentiles have these things. They have salvation, they believe. And, if they endure to the end, they will be in the kingdom reigning with Christ. So now they have these blessings. And I believe that's what he's really. Could there be another meaning to the parable and maybe apply it for judgment, because we do know it gets flipped around. Those who are believers, we're sort of trampled, in this life, and nobody believes us, and he separates us, and then it gets flipped around. Those who are humbled will be lifted up. Those who are prideful will be humbled. Could it be speaking of this too? Maybe so. But I think the primary one is the Jew and Gentile understanding. It was a parable against the Jews, against the Hebrews back then. And so now God helps us, is with Lazarus, with the Gentiles. Abraham's bosom represents, we're connected to Abraham, his bosom inside, from him, God's people, from Abraham. Spiritually, though, not literally like it used to be physically. We're not illegitimate children, they told Christ, He said, I know you're not illegitimate. I know you're sons of Abraham. Then, shortly after, he says, if you were sons of Abraham, you would do the works of Abraham. And they said, we're not illegitimate children. He already acknowledged that they were his literal descendants. But now he's speaking spiritually. Now he's saying, if you were of Abraham, you would do the works. You would do God's works. But you don't. So you're not of Abraham. And they wanted to kill him, because he's making a spiritual connection now. If you're truly a believer in God, you will do God's works. And that's true for every person. So now that's true. Now it has no longer anything to do with a natural kingdom growing naturally, but it's spiritual kingdom connected to Abraham's bosom spiritually by believing. You're grafted into the olive tree. The olive tree represents Israel. It's not Gentile or anything. You're grafted in to the olive tree. And if natural branches got broken and Jerusalem got punished and judged, you don't boast. It says you should fear, because if natural branches got broken, how much more a grafted in branch that he can also break off, and that's the true meaning of Scripture. At no point do we say we're done, we're saved, and as soon as you start thinking like that, you'll fall off the path. That's why Paul says, if you think you stand tall, take heed lest you fall. You can fall and get blinded. It does happen to some people. The branch gets broken off, That's why the story's in there in the Scriptures. Saul, he was a king? Or, he was doing God's works at first, and what was the end of Saul? He took the spirit from him and he fell on his sword. It's an example of not making it or enduring it to the end. Spiritually, someone can spiritually fall on their sword. That's my understanding of the rich man and Lazarus. It has nothing to do with like hell. Once you see this, it's like it's concerning things here right now on earth, actually. is how I primarily see it. It's not even like referring to, it could be referring to judgment too. Like I said, it could be referring for the, Christ was beaten, right? He was mocked. Everyone hated him. But how much did it turn around for him now? He was a nobody, and now who is he? So the saints also, they're nobodies, and then it turns around. So it could be speaking of that too, but primarily dogs are Gentiles receiving crumbs, and now they would start, eating the real food off the table. And basically, the blood Hebrews have crumbs now. See, he flipped the table over. And that's my understanding. Not that there's maybe not another understanding. It's definitely not what the church world teaches, where there's people literally in flames and they're going to be cooled with their one drop of tongue. This torment represents that blinding and spiritual destruction. No faith, no belief. All this time they're not a nation anymore. Jerusalem, old Jerusalem. But instead, New Jerusalem is scattered everywhere, a few in every country, all around the world. And then there's going to be a gathering back to the city. Scriptures talk about this gathering, and this is the setup for the end time deception. It's the setup. I see it. I'm starting to see it, because the whole church world believes these people are truly the Jews of the land. And when the Messiah comes, the false Messiah, they will believe in him. The strong delusion is going to come, and they will believe. They'll believe in him. Save the elect. Like Christ said, even the elect they'll try to deceive. So it's going to be some extremely deceptive thing. And they teach this. They teach that those are God's people over there, but they're not acknowledging that the old covenant passed away. They're still standing by saying that there's physical Jews and that's God's people. You can't do that. That's going back to the old covenant. Paul said this is about to vanish. And, his writings were somewhere in the 50s ADs maybe when he wrote that. A few more years, Jerusalem was going to be done away. It's about to vanish. We can now say it did vanish. The old covenant, natural. There is no importance in blood Jew, but they're not going to teach this in the church world. They're going to teach the importance of blood Hebrews, and they say those people got their land back. And I made a video about this more than once. You had to be obedient and keep God's laws, sacrifices, ordinances, commands to get to the land. Every time they every time they were in disobedience, they got punished. Now they're telling me that those are God's people in Jerusalem over there. They killed people to get that land back, and we know that we're supposed to love our enemies. This was done away with, this carnality of hate your enemy. They killed people to get that land back. Not only that, they don't keep all of Moses' writings. None of them over there do. You have to keep that to be blessed and get the land back. So everything they say, none of it makes sense. Who are those people? I don't know exactly who those people are, but I don't think they have anything to do with Abraham anyways. It's not super important for me, but I believe the scriptures that they're trampled by Gentiles until the times of the end. Whoever these people are, they've been trampled all this time. And God will have mercy eventually, but this is how he flipped it over. It's a shame what they teach, the literal understanding of the parable of rich man and Lazarus. It's a shame what they teach. The parables are not literal. The parables about the seeds all represent something. We're even told, given examples of what they represent. Every parable is like that. The seed represents something. The land represents something. The bird represents something, foul spirit. The weeds represent the world. We're even told on some of these what they represent. But they read it literally and say, this is what happens. We know that's not true. The parables are not literal. They're a near story. They're a near story. It's not the actual thing, but it has a meaning behind the words. It's a parable. It's a proverb. A lot of Proverbs is a parable. A dark saying, And you won't know the truth unless you seek it, and then God will start giving you the meaning to all these parables and what they truly mean. Otherwise, you're going to have a carnal, natural understanding, and it's not going to benefit anything. There's probably more in the parables, but I didn't read it. I just went off of memory. But I think I got the main point down. The dogs are the Gentiles. The crumbs represent very little food. They didn't receive these things, these salvation, and they weren't called God's people. And we have scriptures saying that the Gentiles will be called God's people someday. That's in scripture somewhere between Genesis and Malachi, that this would happen someday, and it did. Paul was that minister along with a few others, but Paul was that main one that spread it and started it and grafted them into the olive tree. And ever since then, it's been Gentiles. And I'm saying it's been 2,000 years almost. It's a long time. It's pretty close to Abraham to Old Covenant, There's not much time left, that's for sure. There's not that much time left for Gentiles being grafted in. And we know that all this time that original Israel is blinded. Like Paul says, they're blinded until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled, or time of the end. But the church building I went to, that parable came up more than once, growing up, the few years I grew up in. And I, even back then, before I believed, I remember thinking, like, I didn't understand what the parable meant back then, but it's like God was already working in me. Like I saw something foul in that. Like, man, really? Literally? I knew it was a parable. I knew that much. I knew it didn't mean exactly what it says, but that's what they taught in my church building, and they're scaring everybody into believing, what kind of love is that? That's, if you don't love me, I'll start twisting your arms, breaking bones, ripping flesh, and if you do love me, well, then I'll reward you. So what? Is it based off fear? That contradicts scripture. If you fear, evil kind of fear, if you fear, your love hasn't been perfected. It's what we read. You can't have that kind of fear. You can't have that kind of fear about God. Proper fear of his judgments, but not the kind of evil fear that they teach in the church world, That oh, and what else happens when you take the parable literally? You get to watch people in heaven suffer down there, wherever hell is. You get to watch them because, in the parable you can see them, I guess. And I suppose saints will be dropping a drop of water every now and then to mock them and laugh at them burn and watch this drop vanish before it even hits their tongue because the flames are thousands of degrees, It's nonsense. And you know what Christ did, and there's more scriptures on this. They alluded to popular beliefs. Scriptures do this. I did some study on this. God showed me this. Old Testament and New Testament. They allude to popular current beliefs of the day, and then they use that to get a truth out. It's actually, I believe Christ is actually mocking any kind of fiery hell, They would have understood something like that. And I think that's one of the few parables that the Jews sort of understood, because it says they knew the parable was against them, and they sought to kill him, and then Christ vanished in the crowd because they knew the parable was against them. It was specifically against Jerusalem. That's what that parable is. And there's other scriptures to line it up with where, he says judgment's coming, woe to you who, have babies in those days and all that. That already happened, but that was a type. Like I said, that's a type of what's going to happen on New Jerusalem's judgment, God's people, which is all over the earth. It's going to happen again, except the final real thing, the final wrath. The wrath happened back then, but it's going to happen again all over the earth. And I went in a lot of detail about that in my other videos, so that's something God showed me too, how that was a type, and it actually did happen. It's just the full thing didn't happen yet. The full thing didn't happen. The kingdom was established, at when at Jerusalem's, passing away. The kingdom was established. In like manner, this new covenant will make way to something else, something better, just like this covenant was better than the last one at his coming. First, his kingdom, he came in his kingdom and established it. It's never going to be removed, this kingdom of heaven. And then he's going to come back in glory. And I went on some videos about preterism and how they teach this all was already fulfilled. It's insane. And I didn't read this anywhere, that this was all a type. That's what God showed me, that this was all, every little thing was a type in Jerusalem that happened. It's going to happen again. It's just going to be on a worldwide scale, and that time is getting close. Today, spiritually, a Gentile is anyone who doesn't believe, and believers are spiritual Jews. So his word didn't go away. There's still Gentiles and Jews. It's just spiritual. Spiritual Gentiles, anyone who doesn't believe. Well, now I'm starting to get further away from that parable, so I better stop.